As storms in teacups go, this one was pretty wild. Lewis Hamilton slammed ridiculous licence penalty rules after edging to the brink of a race ban. Mercedes called the penalties that put him there and wrecked his Russian Grand Prix victory bid far-fetched, and the FIA countered all that by effectively telling the world champion and his team to check the fine print, but then went back a bit on the original decision. Hamilton's been spared the need to drive on eggshells for the next 4 races by the FIA stewards' U-turn, which simply capped a quite extraordinary and very controversial few hours in which Hamilton went to war with the officials and came off second best. Before we dive into the big talking point that let Valtteri Bottas win at Sochi unchallenged and inject some mild spice into the 2020 title race, have a think about subscribing to the race if you haven't already. That way you don't have to stay as squeaky clean as Hamilton to avoid missing anything in the future. Hamilton was deemed to have performed a practice start out of position on a reconnaissance lap in the build-up to the race and was awarded 2 5-second time penalties as a result, plus 1 licence penalty point for each of those decisions. The 2 penalties were for performing the start in the wrong place and for stopping in the pit lane exit. They were considered separate offences because one relates to the race event notes from FIA race director Michael Masi and one to a specific part of the sporting regulations. Masi's notes instructed the drivers to perform a practice start on the right-hand side after the pit exit lights. Hamilton wanted to move further down the pit lane because the main area had a lot of rubber down from so many other practice starts, and he didn't want to do a practice launch with an unrepresentative amount of grip. He took the instruction on where a practice start is allowed to mean anywhere to the right in the pit exit, and cited the Brazilian Grand Prix practice start location as an example. At Interlagos, practice starts happen at the very end of the pit lane exit road, and there are slightly different requirements for each circuit depending on the available space. Mercedes and Hamilton therefore argued the vagueness of the event notes contributed to the uncertainty over where a practice start would be allowed. There was a slight miscommunication though, and we'll get to that shortly, as when the team saw where Hamilton had actually stopped his car, it did assume there'd be an issue of some kind. But it was still hoping to get away with just a slap on the wrist. If Hamilton was allowed to perform the practice start on the exit road, he'd be fine on that point, and by extension a legal practice start would exempt him from the rule that demands drivers going through the whole of the pit lane do so at a constant speed and with constant throttle. Unfortunately for Hamilton and Mercedes, the stewards decreed he was in the wrong. They said he failed to utilise the designated start area and therefore should have maintained his speed until the end of the pit lane. So there were 2 offences and 2 penalties. Hamilton had to wait 10 seconds at his pit stop, dropping him out of the lead and consigning him to 3rd. Plus he had the 2 licence penalty points, nudging him towards a race ban. When asked later on if there was any ambiguity or room for interpretation in the instruction for drivers to perform race starts to the right-hand side after the pit lane exit lights, or if it could be better phrased, race director Masi defended his writing. I'd suggest there was probably a miscommunication between the team and the driver of car 44, because Valtteri and all the other drivers used the exact practice start location where it was immediately on the right after the pit exit lights. Masi also defended the lack of visual identification of the practice start area, saying generally we don't paint a box, we just specify a location, and when asked if a painted box would help in the future replied, it's very much a circuit specific element of where it is, it was just a simple error from that perspective. Hamilton is dominating the 2020 season and is on course for a record equaling 7th title, and even though he didn't do it in Sochi, he's on the verge of equaling another of Michael Schumacher's long-standing records, 91 victories. But he's also pretty close to replicating the Schumacher miscue, being just 4 penalty points short of a race ban. Hamilton found himself on the brink of an automatic suspension in the immediate aftermath of the steward's original decision, as it took him to 10 penalty points in the last 12 months. He'd previously committed 4 offences, each of which earned him 2 licence penalty points. Hamilton collided with Alex Albon in the 2019 Brazilian Grand Prix. Those are the first penalty points he'll lose from his licence, but that won't happen until after the Turkish Grand Prix in mid-November. At this year's season opener in Austria, Hamilton failed to slow for yellow flags in qualifying, then he collided with Albon again in the race. That took him halfway to a race ban in one weekend alone. Then at Monza, Hamilton was guilty of another sporting regulation infraction as he entered the pit lane while it was closed, having failed to notice the trackside panels, which are outlined in the race director's notes. An irate Hamilton fired off a contentious claim that they're trying to stop me immediately after the Sochi race on TV, a stance he did soften slightly a little while later. But he was still furious with what he called ridiculous penalty points, and he had the support of several of his fellow front-running drivers on that matter as well. The general feeling is that a penalty point should only be reserved for the most severe offences, rather than handed out automatically alongside in-season penalties. Max Verstappen, Sebastian Vettel, Charles Leclerc and Daniel Ricciardo all sided with Hamilton on this issue. Hamilton's silver lining in all this is that the licence penalty points were later rescinded and replaced with a €25,000 fine for Mercedes instead. This steward's U-turn came down to their opinion that licence penalty points would have been an inappropriate sanction on review. The steward spoke to Mercedes representatives post-race, gaining knowledge of a radio exchange which for some reason wasn't part of the initial in-race investigation despite being public at the time. It all hinged on a brief conversation and misunderstanding between Hamilton and his race engineer Peter Bonington as Hamilton approached the designated practice start area. Hamilton asked, "It's all rubber here, can I go further around or not?" And when he received an affirmative response, he asked, "To the end of the pit wall." Bono said, "Yeah, copy, as long as you leave enough room for cars to pass." Mercedes hadn't realised quite how far Hamilton meant by that, with the driver referring to the full pit exit road well beyond what turned out to be the only acceptable area to do a practice start. But based on that exchange, the FIA stewards determined Mercedes played a significant role in Hamilton being out of position and felt fining the team €25,000 was more suitable. The regulations around penalties are open to interpretation and tend to retain a wide scope, but there is a specific reference that stewards may impose licence penalty points unless they issue a fine or reprimand. That provided the wiggle room to remove the penalty points, but the stewards left the time penalties in place. Removing a time penalty served at a pit stop doesn't undo the damage like time added on after the race, but in any case the FIA felt the time penalty was still justified. Mercedes was aggrieved that Hamilton was punished in race for a reconnaissance lap infringement, as prior rule breaches in the build-up such as pit lane speeding had been met with fines issued after the Grand Prix. But the FIA was dismissive of such comparisons, viewing them as completely separate infringements. They felt that as Hamilton was seeking an alternative position for the practice start for a more race-relevant preparation, it was a sporting advantage that merited a sporting penalty, so the time penalty stood. Hamilton will no doubt rue the victory he feels he's lost unjustly, but he lives to fight another day and at least he's now got more breathing space between himself and a ban, moving back to 8 points out of 12 instead of 10. Let us know in the comments what you made of the race's big talking point. Was Hamilton right to feel aggrieved, or were the penalties a slam dunk? And what are your thoughts on the licence penalty point system as a whole? Give this video a like if you think we've explained a complicated back and forth quite well, and subscribe to the race if you haven't already. Whether you're anti-Hamilton, anti-FIA, anti-penalties or anti-whatever, hopefully you're pro-us.